now for a fourth video on Django CMS 3.0. Today we're going to talk a little bit about how one would create a plugin like the one shown which handles form responses via AJAX. I've had some questions about this in the IRC channel, and I thought it might be a good topic to cover off. So we're starting with the same installation we've been using for the previous three videos, so if you want to know how we got to this state, you might want to follow along in those. I made a few changes with the templates just because they were becoming an eyesore, and just styled things a little bit and added a more proper column, mostly to make room for this here plugin. So let's get started. So first thing I want to do is show you the new app that I've created, which allows us to attach via an app hook a contact us form. And this is the classic web page form where you want to reach out, somebody wants to reach out to you and leave a comment, and it works great. You can type in your name and all these other fields, and it will indeed save the data in the database. And I've made it so that it will email your stakeholders about the new contact. This video isn't really about creating this simple contact us form, but rather about how to create a plugin version of it that you can use on any page, right? So going back here to the contact us page, this is an app hook, so this is rendering directly from a view, which is rendering directly into a template. I will go over those things briefly, mostly so that we can contrast how things might be a little bit different on the plugin side. But then, like I said, our ultimate goal is to create this here plugin, which we could attach here, or we could attach here maybe if we wanted to, or wherever in your site. So let's have a look at some of the code. The most important part of any new app is probably your models. Here's our app contacts. I have a pretty full gamut of different files here in my module. So model is pretty straightforward. We have a number of fields, the core fields that you would see on the form itself. Then we have some kind of meta fields. So contact date, when was the form submitted. Was contacted, and notes are just meta fields that I put in there where my client, let's say somebody's buying this from me, this integration. My client would be able to use was contacted as a Boolean field and just tick off once they've reached back out to the person who contacted the company. And that's useful in team environments where one person may not know who contacted all the latest people that have contacted the company, etc. And then notes just allows them to put notes in, once they've contacted that person, maybe recorded that they're interested in a product or a service or whatever. Anyway, and then the refer. So I do want to talk a moment about the refer. So the goal on the refer is to record either where the user was before they landed at the contact us page to start filling out a contact request. And the idea here is that if they're looking at product ABC on your site and they're really stoked up about that product and they want to reach out to you and close a sale, that might be interesting to know. So when you're reaching out to the person, you might say, oh, so were you interested in product ABC or whatever. Now I'm calling it referrer here, and it's misspelled because that's the way the HTTP spec is. But when we're using the plugin form, we're not so interested in the refer as much as where the plugin is currently present. We want to know the URL of where the plugin was submitted, and the reason is because in the scenario of an ABC product, which gets people excited about contacting you, we can envision that the plugin would actually be on that page. So we're not interested in the page that they were at before they arrived there, but we're interested in the page where the plugin is. So we're gonna be handling that a little bit differently in the two cases. One where we're capturing the refer for the contact us page, and once where we're just in the other case for the plugin, we're just capturing the actual page where the plugin is found. Moving on. So then I have another method in here which just encapsulates the email notification. The only thing slightly interesting here is that I'm using Django templates to render both the subject line and the body of the email. Not terribly interesting, but it works great, and you know, not a whole lot going on there. And then in the save method, this is where we conditionally send that notification email. So in the life cycle of a contact object, you have its creation, which is where we do want to send a notification email, and we notice that we're in the creation phase of the life cycle because our primary key or ID is not set yet, and we use that as a conditional logic to determine that we need to send the notification email. But no matter what, when we're saving, whether it's new or whether the admin is just editing the object, we're going to go ahead and do the save as per usual. So that's pretty much it. Now down here I have my very simple plugin model that we're going to be using for our plugin when we get to that. Since we're already here, I'll go ahead and cover it. So basically the only thing we're storing is a title. So this is the title that's going to be at the top of the plugin that you put on the page. You could envision that your editors, your site editors, might have a different title that they want to put on different pages when they're putting the plugin. So that's all. Okay, so let's now look at some of the other things that make up both the contact page version and the contact plugin versions. So the other important things, of course, is going to be the forms. You'll remember when I was talking about the models, or maybe I don't remember if I covered that actually. So in the model, what I did is I made sure that to remind myself with this note to make sure that none of the fields that are in the model are required. So I'll have things like blank equals true in each of these fields. The reason is because I don't want to determine here what is going to be required and what is not. I'd rather do that in my form because I have multiple forms, and one form may have different requirements than the other. So in most cases I would say that probably in the model is where you would define if a field is required or not. But in this case, since I know that I'm going to be using it in two different forms, let's go ahead and make that determination in the forms themselves. So let's talk about the form. So I noticed that there was so much similarity between my two forms, one for the plugin page, the contact page, and the other for the plugins, that I decided to abstract the common elements into a base class, and that's what I've defined here, contact base form, which of course extends from model form. Because this is going to be an abstract base class, I'm setting abstract to true here in the meta inner class. Okay, so what are we doing? So the first thing I'm doing here is required CSS class equals required. This is standard Django configuration and basically tells Django when I have a required field, which CSS class am I going to emit, or is it going to emit in the form to let my my templates and my styles know that that is a required field. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. I think this is the default value. I'm just being explicit. Next is verify email. This is a on-the-fly field I'm creating, right? So you might have noticed in the forms when I was showing them to you, I have two fields for entering your email. One, normal email field. The other one is to enter it again to verify that you've typed the same thing in twice. Both of them are standard email fields, sorry, and both of them have to be valid. But the extra thing that we're doing here is we're going to just double check that they are valid and contain the same value, because if they're not, then possibly one of them was a valid email but not their valid email, and we're trying to prevent a situation where they send us a bad email and we can't reach back out to them. So in both forms you are going to create a on-the-fly field. We're creating this on the fly because we don't really want to store this in the database. Once they've they've submitted a valid form, both of these values are going to be the same. There's no reason to store both of them, so we're just going to do it on the fly in the form. Next is required fields. This is a list that I've created. It has nothing to do with any normal Django form usage. But the idea is that we put the required fields that we want in here, and then during the constructor of this class, um, I'm going to run through that list of fields and mark them as required. So just a little bit of helper there to make it easy work of setting my required fields to be required. Next we have a clean method. So when you're dealing with model forms in particular, when we go through the form validation phase, which is kind of done part of the normal processing, the field validation will automatically occur, and because I'm using email field on the emails, Django will automatically check to make sure that those are valid email responses. It doesn't check that they're valid email addresses, right? I mean, they could be bad email addresses, but at least they're constructed in a legitimate way. So user at some set of hosts, fully qualified domain. That's going to happen automatically as a field level validation, but I need a form level validation just to make sure that once those two email fields are valid, that they do and match each other. So if they don't, then I'm going to raise a form validation error and send that back to the user. So that's pretty much it for the forms. Now down here is where I create concrete versions of these forms from the abstract-based class. So in both cases, I'm extending the contact-based form, and I set the model. I set the fields that we're going to be using on this particular form, and then I override the widget for the refer so that it's a hidden field. And then I set my required fields. So you can see in the normal contact form, I have these fields as required: name, email, and verify email. And I have 7 different fields that we're going to be displaying. Whereas in the AJAX form, I'm using a reduced set of fields that we're going to be displaying, of course one of them hidden. And we're only going to require the email and the verify email. So hopefully that was clear on how the forms differ. Very little, once you've abstracted out the common elements, there's very little that's different at all. In fact, this is the same, so that's not even a difference. Okay, so that's our forms. They're very similar. In views, I want to talk a little bit about class-based views. If you're not using them, I encourage you to give them a look. They've been available, I think, since Django 1.4. I'm using Django 1.6 here, and I think that the old function-based views are going to be deprecated at some point, and that part I'm not happy with because sometimes it's just easier to use a function-based view, but not here. The form view, which I'm using here, is doing most of the heavy lifting for me. I only have to do a few lines of code to make sure that these views work. Now, just a little note about form view. That's a very generic view. At the end of the day, I am dealing with a model form, and an argument could be made to use the create view, or at least to use the model form mix-in for the form view. And I've tried it both ways, and I really think that this is the clearest, especially when you take into context that I'm doing this 2 times, and I want them to mirror one another just for clarity. So I'm doing the contact form view. This is the normal view for the app hook, so it's going to, a straight view going to a template. And then down here I have a similar view for the AJAX post handling, which I'll talk about in a moment. But anyway, let's talk about what I do have to override as far as the default form view implementation. So I'm going to provide the form class. In this case, it's the contact form, not the AJAX version, but the regular version. And I have to provide a template. So here's that. I am overriding the default implementation of getInitial, and the only reason is because I want to kind of inject an initial value in here, which is dependent upon the request. If it was a static value I want to put in there, then I could just put it in up here as initial equals and then a dictionary of my initial values. But it does depend on the request, so I did put it into a method. And basically we're just calling the default implementation, and then we augment the dictionary of initial values with a referrer, which is set to the HTTP referrer. And you may recall from our discussion earlier that on the standard app hook form view, we are going to use the page that the user was at before they came to that page, and that is different than how we're going to handle the plugin. So that's where we do that. And then to define the get success URL. So what are we doing when we submit the form? And maybe we should do that real quick. Let me go ahead and type in my name. Skip that for now. Type in my email again, and then submit. Now what happens is it submits the form, and then it takes us to a new page. Now this is kind of best practice, because if somebody reloads this page, they're not going to resubmit the form. They're just going to get this page again, right? And that's useful to prevent resubmissions, but also this gives the stakeholders of the CMS the ability to put whatever content they want here. So how did I set this up? Well, I'll show you. So I'm going to go to the pages, the page tree, and I'm going to go to the thank you page, which we're already on actually. I'm going to go to advanced settings. So in advanced settings, you'll see that there is a field called ID, and this actually comes out to reverse ID in Python or in the ORM. So I just call it contact form submission, and basically I could put that on any page I want, and the code I'm about to show you will take the user to this page when they've successfully submitted your form. Now if they submit your form with validation errors, they will get the same form page again with errors shown. This is only for when they successfully submit your form. So what do we do? Well, what we're doing is we're basically using the standard Django get object or 404 helper, which essentially handles doing a page.objects.get, and if there's too many or too few objects returned, it handles the exceptions. In this case, in both cases, it goes to 404. So what are we doing? We're looking at the page, which is CMS. Let's see. CMS model, page model, right? And then we use the reverse ID I just told you as one of the filter parameters. And then we also specify publisher is draft equals false. So if you're not familiar with the way the CMS stores your page objects in the database, it stores two versions, one for the published state of your page and the other one as a draft state. So this allows you as a page editor to modify the page to your heart's content until you're ready for the public to see it. And then when you publish, then that becomes your published version, and a copy of that remains as the draft version for future edits. So by specifying publisher is draft equals false, I will get only one rather than two page objects that come back, and in particular I'll get the one that's published. So that's an important part of the of this method call. So basically, once I get that page, I just return the get absolute value, absolute URL of that page, and that is more than sufficient for the get success URL requirement for the view. And then finally, I am overriding the default implementation of form valid, which does essentially nothing, because this is a generic form view. It's not a model form view. It doesn't know what to do with a completed form, but I'm telling it what to do, and that is, once you have a valid form, please save it. And of course, because we defined a save override in the model itself, that will trigger the sending of the email to my stakeholders. If we don't have this block, and we are using the form view, then nothing will happen. Your form will not save the model object because it's not aware of it. But anyway, so that's the very simple, I hope you'll agree, contact form view for handling the normal view for this app hook. And if you take away all the comments and my very verbose Python, you'll see that this is really only maybe 6 lines of code, plus these 2 configuration parameters up here. I think it's significantly smaller than what I would have written had I used function-based views. And it's even actually shorter than what I would use if I used create view, or maybe using the model form mix-in might have been, I think that would have saved me having to do this, but I think it had some other requirements. Anyway, moving on. So this is the corresponding view for the AJAX plugin. Now, it looks quite a bit different, even though it's essentially the same. One of the first things you'll notice is I'm adding a AJAXable response mix-in, which I'll cover in a moment. I do still have the form class defined, which in this case I'm giving it the AJAX form, not the other form. So this, if you recall, is almost the same. It just has a reduced set of fields and a reduced set of required fields. Now, this is different than the above, and that is I'm basically saying that this view is an error. You will get an error if you come to this view outside of a post, right? So if you try to do a get or a head method, you will get an error. And the reason is because we're only interested in handling the AJAX post responses from form submissions. Now, you'll have to remember that when you're rendering a plugin, especially one with a form, instead of handling both the get side and the post side of the multiple get response cycles in one view, like we do up here, right? The get initial is involved in the initial view of the page, which was handled on a get request, and then some of these other methods are handled only on the post. So when you posted your data, then different things will happen. Well, in this case, all the get side, the initial rendering of the plugin, the initial creation of the form, is actually handled within the plugin itself. And this view is only responsible for those AJAX posts that we're going to be making outside of the normal get response cycle. So that's why I've limited my handling to only posts. And I put a comment here. Obviously this isn't required. I put it here just to remind you that we're not interested in setting the get initial like we did in the other version, for the reason I just told you. That's actually handled in the plugin, and I'll show you that in a minute. So we can remove this. And the next one is the get success URL. So I'm actually not, I don't really need this because we're not going to go anywhere once we have a successful form submission, right? However, it is a requirement for the form view that this is either defined up here as success URL, or, and I could just do this and be done with it, because it'll never really be used unless maybe the JavaScript doesn't work or whatever. But I thought it might make sense to use a sensible default. So what I am doing is I'm saying, if for some reason the form is submitted and the AJAX handler written in JavaScript doesn't intercept the submission button, then the request actually does come here as a post, then go ahead and try to respond back with the page that we came from. Now, I'm not actually implementing a AJAX implementation. I don't know who coined that term, but I think it's very clever. Basically a hijack AJAX combination. The idea being that you have a normal form that will work outside of JavaScript, but when JavaScript is present, it goes ahead and AJAX-ifies everything and hijacks the normal request response cycle. We're not actually implementing that here. I could, but I've actually run some tests, and I found that there are essentially 0 people who have JavaScript disabled. Now, there are some special scenarios, and this is a little bit off topic, but if you are building a product which is going to have a high population of users using screen readers for disabilities or whatever, they may not have a a JavaScript implementation, and by all means, you should implement the AJAX variant of this, but I'm not. This is a simple example, and we want to keep it simple. But nonetheless, I'm required to provide a success URL, so I thought I'd go ahead and use a sensible default. So this right here is not all that required, but I mean, it's required, but we just have a one-line thing here. So this is the only thing that we're really doing, and that is, what do we do when we have a valid form? And in this case, there's a lot that's going to be handled up here, which I'll show you in a minute, but we just need to make sure that we have an object. And I found that I had to put commit equals true here, and that made everything work nicely. But other than that, take that line out, and it's the default implementation. So it's basically, we have 2 lines that we're doing here to handle AJAX responses. Most of the work is handled here in form view, and the rest of the most is being handled by this mixin right here, what I'm gonna show you now. So where did this mixin come from? It came from here. Now this is the Django docs, right? So some clever people at Django created this mixin to help everybody out. So why not use it? And basically, you just throw this into an existing view. They suggest create view, it looks like, but I'm using form view. And it implements a number of overrides to existing methods. I think this one actually is not a override, but a new implementation. But anyway, could be wrong on that. Anyway, and this one definitely is. It's a new method. But basically, all that code is right here. It's verbatim with one exception. I've taken this line out here, this little bit out here, this extra keyword, status equals 400. So this was actually causing errors in my JavaScript. And probably it's correct to keep this in here, and I should probably update my JavaScript, but I didn't. And by taking this out, everything works beautifully. Very, very minor change. Okay, so what does this do? Basically, it packages up, it checks to see if we're on an AJAX request, and if we are, it packages up in a responses. Instead of rendering to a template, it packages up that response, including all the form validation errors, into a JSON object and returns that. Or if it's a valid form submission, then it packages up the primary key of the object it just created and sends that off to the response. So now let's have a look at my JavaScript and see how we're handling all this stuff. So this is my JavaScript. I do have some of the bits hidden here, but it's pretty simple nonetheless. Basically, I just check and see, if a submit button on a contacts plugin was clicked, and I handle that. And if so, then I crawl up the parents list until I find the form, so I know which form I'm dealing with, and store that as a JavaScript object. And then I prevent any default action on the event. So I don't want to actually let the browser handle the form submission. I want to do it myself, so I prevent that. Here's where I'm just grabbing, I'm hiding the existing errors and success fields that I've got defined. I just hide the old ones and getting ready to prepare to show any new errors or success messages. Then I do the AJAX, right? I'm going to do a post. I'm going to use the action attribute on the form as the go-to URL, which I think we've covered already. And this little bit of magic here takes all of the fields in the form, serializes it into a response and into a data object, and this is what I'm going to send to the server. So super easy. And then here we're using the response object to handle a response, and I use always rather than done or fail, just because I basically handle whether it's a successful or a not successful response up here. So let's look at that. So here's where I do the work. Basically, if I detect that there is a primary key returned, then it was successful. So what I do is I basically show the success message, which is already baked into the HTML markup, and looks like I hide the rest of the form and the legend, which sits next to the form in the markup. I hide all that so that people don't, so it's clear to people that the submission occurred and that they don't click it twice or whatever to resubmit the same data. Just makes for a nice, clear communication to the user about what's happened. If there was a validation error, well, then we try to parse out what that data returned is. So it's going to come back in the form of the JavaScript equivalent of a dictionary or a JavaScript object containing the field names followed by a list of, or an array of the errors. So basically what I do is I go through the first I hide all the old ones, and then I go through the data and I find any field with that name, and then on that field I find the error markup and I fill it with a joined value of all of the errors in the list, and then that's pretty much it. Now the other case is that there could be form validation errors as opposed to field validation errors, and those are going to be stored in a special property on the data object, which is this funny name here, underscore underscore all underscore underscore. This is done by Django. I didn't do it. And basically it's the same thing, right? It's going to return on that property of this object, it's going to return a list of all the validation errors. So again, I just find the appropriate errors element in our markup, and I fill it with all of those errors joined together. And that's pretty much it. I do a little bit, tiny bit of animation here to turn different things on and off for clarity. But how you handle the validation errors is up to you. But this is pretty straightforward code. In this case, jQuery is handling most of the heavy lifting for us, and it's pretty easy. So, here's our markup for the plugin. As I think I pointed out earlier, I'm not sure, I've done multiple takes of this video. I did put the form I don't think I actually looked at the CMS plugin yet. So if I did, I apologize for duplicating it, but otherwise, here's what the plugin looks like. I'm declaring, the plugin model. We looked at that already in the models.py file. It's basically just a title field. The name, this is what's going to appear in the list of plugins and our placeholders. Here's our template, which we were just looking at. And then here's a render method. Now this is where we handle the initial view, and this is where we have to create the initial values for the form, right? So the form I'm setting to the initial, I construct the form, but I'm setting an initial value for the refer. And if you recall from earlier discussions, when we're using the plugin version, we want the actual page that we're on, not the page that we came from. So I'm going to use just simply request.path ultimately, and put that in as a refer, and then we're good. So then I package up the title, which we got from our model object, a plugin model, the form, which we just created. And I'm also going to pass in a parameter form action, which is where I reverse against my URLs configuration here, and I just say, go get me this URL, and this URL is the view, which we were just looking at, which handles all of our post submissions. So the plugin is going to take that URL, place it into a context variable form action, and my partial template is going to put that into the form's action attribute. And if you recall from the JavaScript, that's what we use precisely for the destination of the AJAX post. So all of the pieces have fit together very nicely, and now let's watch it work. So I'm going to go to my, close out of that. I'm going to go to my leadership page where I've declared one of these plugins. Let's go ahead and type in my name, and I'll get my email address wrong here, and then I'll get it correct here just so we can watch some validation happen, and whatever. So we have an error. So let's have a look and see what that error is, and look at some of the ways we can troubleshoot this. So in this case, we have come back with, we see over here that we've got something wrong, 500 error, And we can look and see a little bit about what that error was by looking, well, let's resubmit it with the network tab open. So we can have a look at what's going to happen. I'll type in this stuff again here. And we can see the request on the post, and it came back with a 500 error. And we can see what that is by coming over here and having a look. So it looks like we are required to have template name also on, it says template mixin, but yeah, we need to either have get template name or template name defined in our view. So let's go over to our view, and yes, sure enough, we don't have a template name defined, so I'm going to paste that in there. Now, this is not actually going to be used, so we could set this to, almost nothing. But again, as we were setting a sensible default down here, just in case JavaScript wasn't used, we'll do the same up here. Now, unfortunately, because this isn't a proper AJAX implementation, this is really just going to render a partial as a whole page, and that's not really going to be good. So some more thought will have to be given here, but for right now, we know that we need to have a template name defined, and we'll use a sensible default. Maybe another sensible default would be to go to a 500 page or something, I don't know, or a 404 page. But we're going to go ahead and use this for now. All right, now that we've saved that again, let's go back to our form. I'll close my Chrome debugger thingy, and then let's submit it again, see what happens. So here's my name, here's my email address, AOL.com, and by the way, that's not a real email address. And here's another email address, 123, whatever, and we hit submit. What happens? Okay, so what's happened is our form validation has kicked in and said, okay, yeah, that looks like a legit email address. This one also looks legit, but you know what? They don't match. So that's a form validation error, not a field validation error. So I don't change anything here, but I put it here. Let me show you what happens if I don't supply a valid email address at all. Pardon me. So if I hit submit now, we'll still get the form validation error because these two do not match. But now we also have this extra error here, which says please provide a valid email address. So I'm going to go ahead and use the correct email address in both cases, and we'll see what happens when we have a valid submission. Bingo. Okay, so that should conclude our tutorial on how to create an AJAX-ified CMS plugin. I hope this was helpful. I know I was going very quickly, but I hope it was helpful anyway. Thank you. Bye.